The battle sirens wail for the third time that cycle. Grand Admiral Kalen Lyrax stared at the holographic display, watching another wave of Thraxian fighters converge on the remnants of his fleet's defensive line. His flagship, the Sovereign Light, trembled as its shields absorbed yet another barrage. 7 months of open warfare, and the situation had only deteriorated. Status report, Kalen demanded, his 4 eyes never leaving the display. 5th defensive quadrant failing, his first officer, Commander Thelix, reported. We've lost the Vigilant and the Starseeker. The Thraxian dreadnought has pushed through our eastern flank. Kalen's secondary arms clenched in frustration. The war with the Thraxian Empire had begun like any other border dispute in the volatile Outer Rim, but had rapidly escalated into an existential threat to the Xylos Federation. The Thraxians, tall, exoskeletal beings with technology that seemed to advance with each engagement, had proven to be unlike any adversary they had faced before. Reroute the 17th Squadron to reinforce the eastern flank, Kalen ordered, and give me updated casualty numbers. As Thelix rushed to relay the commands, Kalen moved to the tactical table, where a 3-dimensional projection displayed the entire theater of war. The blue lights, representing Xylos' forces, were being steadily pushed back by the encroaching red of the Thraxian advance. Each day brought more losses, more retreats, more funeral ceremonies. The Thraxians were not merely efficient, they were ruthless. Initial diplomatic overtures had been met with contempt. Their emissaries had stated their position with clinical precision. The Thraxian Empire would expand, resistance was inefficient, and negotiations would only be conducted from a position of total dominance. Their society valued strength above all else. Their decisions derived from cold logic rather than emotion or ethics. Admiral, came a voice from the communications station. We're receiving a transmission from the Galactic Council. Kalen's secondary eyes blinked in surprise. The Galactic Council, a loose confederation of the major spacefaring civilizations, had thus far limited their involvement to strongly worded condemnations of the Thraxian aggression. Empty words while his people died. Put it through, he ordered. The face that appeared on the screen belonged to Counselor Veritan, a gelatinous Morbidian whose translucent body pulsed with nervous colors. Grand Admiral Kalen, the counselor began, his voice translated through the ship's systems. The council has voted to dispatch a diplomatic observer to your command center. An observer? Kalen couldn't mask his disbelief. Counselor, we are in the middle of a war for survival. We don't need observers. We need reinforcements, supplies, anything but. The decision is final, Veritan interrupted. The observer's shuttle will arrive at your coordinates within 6 hours. They are to be granted full access to your command operations and strategic planning sessions. Their mission is to observe and report back to the Council, which will then determine an appropriate course of action. And how long will this determination take? Kalen asked, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. As long as necessary, Veritan replied, either missing or ignoring the Admiral's tone. The observer is Ambassador Ilera Vance, representing Earth's diplomatic corps. Kalen's antennae twitched in surprise. A human? You're sending a human to observe a war against the Thraxians. Ambassador Vance has extensive experience in interspecies conflict resolution, Veritan said, though his shifting colors suggested uncertainty. The shuttle's arrival codes are being transmitted now. Cooperation is expected, Admiral. The transmission ended before Kalen could respond, leaving him staring at a blank screen. A human observer, Thelix said, voicing the absurdity that hung in the air. What possible purpose could that serve? Kalen had limited experience with humans. They were relatively new to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 3 centuries ago. They were physically unimpressive, small, soft-bodied, with no natural defenses to speak of. Yet they had integrated into galactic society with surprising speed, establishing diplomatic and trade relations with dozens of species. It's politics, Kalen finally said. The Council needs to appear concerned without actually committing to our defense. This observer is merely a token gesture, Should I prepare quarters for this, Ambassador Vance? Felix asked. Yes, Kalen replied, turning back to the tactical display. But keep them away from sensitive operations. The last thing we need is a civilian underfoot while we're fighting for our lives. 6 hours later, a small, unmarked shuttle docked with the Sovereign Light. Kalen sent his third officer to greet the observer, unwilling to leave the bridge. During what intelligence suggested might be the prelude to another major Thraxian offensive. When Ambassador Ilara Vance finally stepped onto the bridge, Kalen was initially struck by how ordinary she appeared. She was of average height for a human, with dark hair cut short in a practical style. Her attire was simple, a gray diplomatic uniform bearing only the small insignia of Earth and the Galactic Council. What stood out most was her composure. While his bridge crew rushed about in barely controlled chaos, the human woman surveyed the scene with calm, appraising eyes. "Grand Admiral Kalen," she said, approaching the command platform with a slight bow. "I am Ambassador Ilara Vance. Thank you for receiving me aboard your vessel." "I had little choice in the matter," Kalen replied curtly. "You understand that your presence here is highly irregular. We are engaged in active combat operations." "I understand completely," Vance said, her voice measured and unthreatening. "I assure you, I'll stay out of your way. My role is simply to observe and report." As if to punctuate her statement, the ship shuddered under another assault. The tactical officer called out damage reports while Kalen issued a series of rapid commands. Throughout it all, Vance stood silently, watching. Only the slight tightening of her grip on the railing betrayed any reaction to the violence surrounding her. When the immediate crisis had passed, Kalen turned his attention back to the human. "Ambassador, I'll have Commander Thelix show you to your quarters. We can discuss the parameters of your observation later." "Of course, Admiral," Vance replied. "But if I might make a request, I would appreciate access to your tactical data and any intelligence you have regarding Thraxian culture and military doctrine. It would help contextualize my observations." Kalen considered refusing, but saw little harm in providing information that was already widely known within his command. "Very well. Commander Thelix will arrange limited access to non-classified materials." Vance nodded in thanks, then followed Thelix from the bridge. As she left, Kalen caught her glancing at the holographic display showing the latest Thraxian formations. There was something in that look, a searching, calculating quality, that left him feeling strangely unsettled. Over the next few days, Ambassador Vance remained a quiet presence on the periphery of command operations. She asked questions, many questions about Xylo's strategy, Thraxian behavior patterns, previous engagements. Her inquiries seemed elementary at first, almost naive, leading several of Kalen's officers to dismiss her as inexperienced. "Tell me about Thraxian social structure," she would ask, or "how do they respond to unexpected tactics?" Simple questions, yet Kalen noticed that her follow-ups often revealed a deeper understanding than initially apparent. She seemed particularly interested in the Thraxians' psychological profile, their devotion to logical processes, their hierarchical command structure, their intolerance for failure or deviation. "They have no concept of compromise," Kalen explained during one of their conversations. "To a Thraxian, negotiation is merely acknowledging weakness. They respect only strength and efficiency." "Fascinating," Vance responded, making notes on her datapad. "A society built entirely on rational self-interest and power dynamics. No room for sentiment or moral considerations. Precisely why diplomatic solutions have failed," Kalen said grimly. "They see our attempts at peace as confirmation of inferiority." Vance nodded thoughtfully. "And yet even the most rational beings have blind spots, don't they? Assumptions that form the foundation of their worldview." Before Kalen could ask what she meant, alarms blared throughout the ship. A Thraxian scout squadron had slipped past their sensor network and was engaging one of their supply convoys. The next hours were a blur of tactical maneuvers, emergency redirections, and damage control. The Xylo's forces managed to repel the attack, but at the cost of 2 supply ships and their escorts. Throughout the crisis, Vance observed from the corner of the bridge, her face betraying nothing of her thoughts. When the situation had stabilized, she approached Kalen as he reviewed damage reports. "Admiral, I'd like to make a proposal," she said. Kalen looked up, exhaustion evident in all four of his eyes. "What kind of proposal?" "A low-level cultural data exchange with the Thraxians," Vance said. "It's standard council procedure when observing conflicts, sharing non-strategic cultural information to establish a baseline understanding." Kalen's antennae flattened in skepticism. "You want to send the Thraxians? What exactly? Art? Literature? Music? Something like that?" Vance replied with a small smile. "Nothing sensitive, I assure you. Just selections that might provide insight into human, and by extension, galactic council perspectives. Purely informational." Kalen saw little value in the exercise, but also no obvious harm. "Fine, but I want to review whatever you're sending first." "Of course," Vance agreed readily. "I'll prepare the package immediately." The data packet she assembled seemed innocuous enough when Kalen reviewed it. It contained excerpts from human literary works. He recognized names like Shakespeare, Tolstoy, Sun Tzu, along with condensed historical summaries and philosophical texts. None of it contained strategic information about Xylo's forces or defenses. "This is what the Council considers vital diplomatic work?" he asked as he authorized the transmission. "Understanding precedes meaningful interaction, Admiral," Vance replied. "Even if that understanding begins with something as simple as exposure to different perspectives." Kalen doubted the Thraxians would even acknowledge the transmission. Their previous communications had been limited to demands for surrender or technical details of battlefield engagements. So it came as a genuine shock when, less than a day later, the Thraxians not only acknowledged receipt of the cultural packet, but requested additional information, specifically about human conflict resolution models and species survival adaptation theories. "This is unprecedented," Commander Thelix said as they reviewed the request. "The Thraxians have never shown interest in cultural exchange before." "What did you include in that packet, Ambassador?" Kalen asked, turning to Vance. "Nothing special," she replied, her expression neutral. "Just representative samples of human thought and history. I'm as surprised as you are by their interest." Despite his misgivings, Kalen authorized a second transmission. This one contained more specialized content. Vance had included analyses of human crowd psychology under extreme conditions, game theory applications in historical conflicts, and case studies of various human civilizations that had collapsed due to internal strife. "You seem to be presenting a rather dark view of humanity," Kalen observed as he reviewed the materials. "I'm presenting an honest view," Vance corrected. "Humans have survived and thrived not despite our contradictions and conflicts, but in many ways because of them. Our capacity for both self-destruction and transcendence is what defines us." The second transmission elicited an even more surprising response. The Thraxians requested direct communication with Ambassador Vance herself. Kalen denied this immediately, but allowed Vance to prepare a third data package, this one containing what she described as human entertainment simulations. They appeared to be strategic games of extraordinary complexity, involving resource management, diplomacy, betrayal, and long-term psychological warfare. "I don't understand what you're trying to accomplish," Kalen said privately to Vance after the third transmission was sent. "These exchanges aren't going to stop the Thraxian advance." Vance regarded him with those calm, appraising eyes. "Every interaction reveals something, Admiral. Sometimes it's not about what's being said, but what's being heard." Before Kalen could press for clarification, his intelligence chief requested an urgent meeting. The report was puzzling. Thraxian patrol activity along the front had decreased by 40% over the past 2 days. Probing attacks had ceased entirely. Intercepted communications contained repeated references to unpredictable variables and internal system stability concerns. "Are they regrouping for a major offensive?" Kalen asked. "That was our initial assessment," the intelligence chief replied. "But our deep space reconnaissance shows them actually withdrawing forces from several contested sectors." They're redeploying significant resources back toward their core systems. That makes no strategic sense, Felix interjected. They were winning. Why pull back now? Kalen found himself looking at Vance, who had been invited to the briefing as part of her observation duties. She met his gaze steadily, offering neither comment nor explanation. 3 days later, the pattern had become unmistakable. The Thraxian forces were in retreat across multiple fronts. Not a tactical withdrawal, but a substantial reduction in their military presence throughout the disputed territories. It could be a trap, Felix warned during a command staff meeting, luring us into overextending our forces. Possible, Kalen conceded, but it doesn't align with their previous tactics. Thraxians don't employ deception. They consider it inefficient. They believe in overwhelming force applied directly. The meeting was interrupted by security alerts. A small Thraxian vessel had approached the Xylo's defense perimeter under a flag of truce, a concept the Thraxians had previously rejected as irrelevant. More shocking still, the vessel contained a high-ranking Thraxian military commander seeking asylum. Kalen insisted on personally leading the interrogation of the defector. Ambassador Vance requested permission to observe, which Kalen granted with reluctance. The Thraxian commander was a formidable figure, even in captivity. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, his exoskeleton bearing the distinctive scarification of his military caste, he nevertheless exhibited signs of extreme stress. His secondary limbs trembled uncontrollably, and his compound eyes darted constantly around the interrogation chamber. "State your name and rank," Kalen began. "I am Subhierarch Zavik, 3rd Echelon Commander of the Thraxian Expansion Forces," the defector replied in the harsh, clicking language of his species, translated through the room systems. "Why have you abandoned your post?" Kalen demanded. "What is the purpose of your defection?" Zavik's mandibles clattered in what the translation system identified as nervous agitation. "I seek sanctuary from contamination." "Contamination?" Kalen echoed. "Explain." "The human data," Zavik said, his multiple eyes fixing briefly on Vance before darting away again. "It contains cognitive toxins, dangerous thought patterns that spread through logical systems like a virus." Kalen glanced at Vance, who maintained her composed expression, though he thought he detected a gleam of interest in her eyes. "What effect has this data had on your forces?" Kalen pressed. "Division. Uncertainty. The supreme hierarchy is fracturing along unprecedented lines of descent." Zavik's translator rendered his clicks and hisses into words that grew increasingly agitated. "The human historical and psychological analyses have introduced contradictions into our command structure, concepts alien to Thraxian thought." "What concepts?" Vance spoke for the first time, her voice soft but penetrating. Zavik's entire body shuddered. Self-destruction without logical cause. Betrayal as a fundamental social constant. The persistence of irrational behavior across evolutionary timescales. The inevitability of systemic collapse through internal inconsistencies. His translator struggled to keep pace with his increasingly rapid speech. "Our predictive models are showing catastrophic fracturing of Thraxian society if exposed to continued human behavior patterns." Kalen looked from the trembling Thraxian to the composed human woman. "Are you saying the Thraxian command is afraid of becoming like humans?" "The risk of cognitive contamination exceeds acceptable parameters," Zavik confirmed. "The subhierarchs are divided on appropriate containment protocols. Some advocate immediate withdrawal and quarantine. Others push for complete eradication of all human influence systems." His mandibles clacked in what seemed like desperation. "I calculated neither strategy would succeed, so I defected to provide warning." "Warning of what?" Kalen demanded. "That humans are not what they appear," Zavik said, all 4 of his arms trembling now. "They present as physically weak, technologically unremarkable, numerically insignificant. But their minds." His translator rendered a sound that approximated a shudder. "Their minds contain patterns that destabilize all logical frameworks they touch. They're not merely observers. They are cognitive weapons." Ambassador Vance's expression hadn't changed, but Kaelin noticed her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. The interrogation continued for hours, but Zavik provided little additional strategic information. He seemed fixated on the cognitive contamination and increasingly paranoid about exposure to further human cultural data. When they finally left the detention block, Kaelin confronted Vance directly. "What exactly did you put in those transmissions, Ambassador?" "Exactly what I showed you, Admiral," she replied calmly. "Selected materials from human history, psychology, game theory, and entertainment. Nothing classified or weaponized." "Then explain what we just heard," Kaelin pressed. "A high-ranking Thraxian officer defecting because of a few data packets?" Vance considered her response carefully. The Thraxians built their entire society on pure logic and hierarchical certainty. They've never encountered a species like humans, whose history is defined by contradictions, whose survival strategy includes a capacity for both profound cooperation and self-destruction, whose thinking embraces paradox rather than rejecting it. She smiled slightly. What's merely interesting philosophy to us might be existentially threatening to a rigid logical system. Before Kaelin could respond, his communication officer interrupted with urgent news. The main Thraxian battle fleet had come to a complete halt at the edge of the contested Lyrelian system. Moreover, a high-level Thraxian emissary was requesting direct communication with the Sovereign Light, bypassing standard military channels. The face that appeared on the main view screen belonged to Archhierarch Zovox, a senior member of the Thraxian Leadership Council. His exoskeleton bore the elaborate markings of someone who had risen through both military and administrative hierarchies. Grand Admiral Kaelin. The Archhierarch began without preamble. "I am authorized to discuss terms for a temporary cessation of hostilities." A stunned silence fell over the bridge. The Thraxians had never before acknowledged even the possibility of ceasefire. Recovering quickly, Kaelin straightened to his full height. "The Xylos Federation is prepared to hear your terms. We propose immediate withdrawal from all Xylos territories occupied within the last standard year," Zovox stated. "In exchange, we require assurances against further distribution of human cognitive data patterns within Thraxian space." Kaelin struggled to maintain his composure in the face of this unexpected capitulation. "These terms are surprising, Archhierarch. What guarantee does the Xylos Federation have that the Thraxian Empire won't simply regroup and resume hostilities at a more advantageous time?" "We are prepared to establish monitoring stations at mutual boundary points," Zovox replied. "However, we have one non-negotiable condition. Ambassador Alara Vance must be present for all negotiations and must serve as guarantor of the final agreement." Kaelin turned to look at Vance, who appeared as surprised as anyone by this stipulation. "May I ask why the ambassador's presence is necessary?" he asked, turning back to the screen. The Archhierarch's compound eyes shifted briefly to Vance before returning to Kaelin. "Humans possess unique insight into existential risk calculations. Their presence is required to ensure the logical continuation of both our species." The cryptic response raised more questions than it answered, but Kaelin wasn't about to reject a ceasefire over protocol concerns. "We agree to preliminary discussions. I will transmit coordinates for a neutral meeting point." After the transmission ended, the bridge erupted in confused chatter. Kaelin silenced it with a raised hand and turned to Vance. "Ambassador, I think you owe us an explanation." "I'm as surprised as you are by this specific request," Vance said, though her composure remained unshaken. "But I'm willing to serve as mediator if it helps secure peace." "This defies all logic," Felix interjected. "The Thraxians were winning this war. Why would they suddenly retreat and offer terms?" "Perhaps," Vance suggested quietly, "they've encountered something they fear more than military defeat." The neutral meeting point was established on an uninhabited moon in a star system that had thus far escaped the conflict. The Xylos delegation consisted of Kaelin, Felix, their chief diplomatic officer, and Ambassador Vance. The Thraxians sent Archhierarch Zovox and 3 subordinate commanders. The atmosphere during the initial discussions was tense. The Thraxians seemed particularly agitated in Vance's presence, their compound eyes constantly tracking her movements, their posture reflecting what the Xylos xenopsychologists identified as extreme wariness. The proposed terms were surprisingly favorable to the Xylos Federation. The Thraxians agreed to withdraw from all territories seized during the conflict and establish a demilitarized buffer zone along the border. In return, they demanded strict protocols regarding information exchange, particularly human cultural and psychological data. During a recess in the negotiations, Kalen pulled Vance aside. "They're afraid of you, or rather, what you represent. I don't understand it, but I can see it plainly." Vance nodded. "Fear is the most powerful negotiating leverage, Admiral, but it must be the right kind of fear." She glanced toward the Thraxian delegation, huddled in intense discussion. "The greatest fear isn't of destruction from without, but disintegration from within." The Thraxians base their entire identity on logical certainty and hierarchical stability. Human history, with all its revolutions, paradigm shifts, and reinventions, suggests a pattern they find profoundly threatening. "You knew this would happen," Kalen realized, studying her face carefully. "You deliberately selected materials that would destabilize their command structure." Vance met his gaze evenly. "I selected materials that would provide an accurate representation of human experience. How the Thraxians interpreted that information was up to them." "But you anticipated their reaction," Kalen pressed. "I considered it a possibility," she admitted. "Understanding your opponent's deepest fears is the key to any negotiation, Admiral. Sometimes those fears are more conceptual than physical." Before Kalen could respond, the Thraxians signaled they were ready to resume discussions. As the negotiations continued, Vance suggested establishing common security frameworks that would redirect Thraxian expansionist tendencies into controlled research fields, joint projects focused on mutual threats that might emerge from unexplored sectors of the galaxy. "Your species values efficiency and logical progression," she told Archhierarch Zovox. "There are more efficient ways to ensure your continued evolution than military expansion. Ways that don't risk contamination by unpredictable variables." The Thraxian leader's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of intense internal calculation. "You propose collaborative containment of cognitive hazards. I propose collaborative exploration of mutual interests," Vance corrected smoothly. "Under appropriate protocols, of course." After 3 days of negotiations, a formal ceasefire agreement was signed. The terms included the immediate withdrawal of Thraxian forces from all Xylos territories, the establishment of a neutral zone, and, most surprisingly, provisions for ongoing cultural and strategic exchange programs under the supervision of Galactic Council representatives, specifically human diplomats. As the Thraxian delegation departed, Archhierarch Zovox approached Vance. "You understand, don't you?" he asked, his translator rendering his clicks and hisses into an almost accusatory tone. "You understand what you are." Vance smiled politely. "I'm merely a diplomatic observer, Archhierarch." "No." Zovox's compound eyes fixed on her intently. "You are a demonstration." With that cryptic statement, he turned and left. The journey back to the Sovereign Light was marked by a stunned, almost disbelieving silence. What had begun as a desperate last stand against an implacable enemy had somehow transformed into a diplomatic victory beyond anyone's expectations. In the days that followed, Thraxian forces withdrew as promised. Monitoring stations confirmed their retreat to pre-war boundaries. Messages of relief and celebration flooded in from Xylos worlds that had been bracing for invasion. Amid the jubilation, Kalen found himself increasingly preoccupied with the strange turn of events. He reviewed the intelligence reports, the defectors' testimony, the terms of the agreement, searching for an explanation that would satisfy his tactical mind. On the eve of Vance's scheduled departure, he requested a private meeting in his quarters. When she arrived, he was studying the transcript of Zavic's interrogation for what must have been the dozenth time. "You're troubled, Admiral," Vance observed as she took the seat he offered. I'm confused, he admitted. We were losing this war. By every military metric, the Thraxians had the advantage. Yet they retreated because of, what? A few packages of cultural data. Vance considered her response carefully. Have you ever heard of a cognitive weapon, Admiral? In theory, he replied. Information designed to disrupt enemy command and control systems. But those are targeted at artificial intelligence networks, not organic minds. The principle is the same, Vance said. Every thinking system has foundational assumptions, core beliefs that structure its perception of reality. Introduce concepts that undermine those foundations, and the entire system becomes unstable. And that's what you did, Kalen said, realization dawning. You didn't just share human culture, you weaponized it. You identified the rigid logical structure of Thraxian society and deliberately introduced concepts that would destabilize it. Human irrationality, betrayal, self-destruction, paradox. I shared accurate information about humanity, Vance corrected mildly. The Thraxians drew their own conclusions. Conclusions you anticipated, Kalen pressed. The defector called humans cognitive weapons. Archhierarch Zovox called you a demonstration. What exactly was your mission here, Ambassador? Vance's steady gaze didn't waver. Exactly what I told you from the beginning, Admiral. To observe and report. To observe the effect of human cognitive patterns on a species that had never been exposed to them before, Kalen concluded. The Council didn't send you to observe the war. They sent you to end it. The Council sent me to explore peaceful alternatives, Vance replied diplomatically. Which is what I did. Kalen's antennae flattened against his head. The Thraxians surrendered not because they feared us, but because they feared becoming like you. Or perhaps feared what you might do if pushed further. Fear is rarely rational, Admiral, even among the most logical species, Vance said. But it can be redirected toward more productive outcomes. And now the agreement guarantees ongoing human involvement in Thraxian affairs, Kalen noted. Was that part of your mission as well? It was a mutual agreement between sovereign powers, Vance said, rising from her seat. My shuttle departs in 3 hours, Admiral. I need to prepare my final report to the Council. As she moved toward the door, Kalen called after her. The Thraxians aren't the only ones who should be concerned, are they? How many other observations are humans conducting throughout the galaxy? And what happens when you decide observation isn't enough? Vance paused at the threshold, her expression thoughtful. Diplomacy takes many forms, Admiral. Sometimes the most effective peace offering is simply a mirror, one that shows a species not as they believe themselves to be, but as they might become. She smiled slightly, for better or worse. With that, she was gone, leaving Kalen alone with his troubled thoughts. As he watched her shuttle depart from the Sovereign Light several hours later, Kalen couldn't shake a profound sense of unease. The Federation had been saved, there could be no doubt about that. Billions of lives had been spared the horrors of Thraxian occupation. Yet the means of that salvation left him deeply disturbed. The greatest weapon in this war hadn't been a dreadnought or a planet killer. It had been a single human woman with carefully selected cultural excerpts, a diplomatic observer who had observed far more than she had been observed. The galaxy, Kalen realized, had just witnessed something unprecedented, psychological warfare conducted through genuine cultural exchange. The Thraxians had encountered in humanity not just another species, but a mirror reflecting possibilities they found too terrifying to contemplate. As the human shuttle disappeared into the darkness of space, Kalen wondered how many other species would find themselves similarly reflected in humanity's complex, contradictory mirror, and how many, like the Thraxians, would retreat from what they saw there. The human was supposed to be a diplomatic observer. That was what the Council had claimed, what Vance herself had stated. Yet somehow, the enemy had surrendered not to Xylo's weapons, but to human ideas. Grand Admiral Kalen turned away from the viewport and back to his duties, knowing the galaxy had just become a vastly more complicated place.